Welcome to this 55-minute lecture on differentiated instruction for equitable and enabling teaching. If you want to teach a lesson that is differentiated, the most important first step to take is to be absolutely crystal clear about what your objectives are. You can think about things you want students to know. This would be basic knowledge, facts, and information. You could think about maybe things you want students to deeply understand. These might be concepts or relationships. And you need to be clear about what you want students to be able to do. These would be skills or approaches, maybe algorithms in math, maybe applying certain editing skills when they're writing. You need to be clear about this so that you can be absolutely clear with them about it. So just think of the huge and wide variety of different things that children have to know, understand, and do at school. Um, Throughout any one day, they might ask to solve problems or do some handwriting, maybe stand up and do some public speaking, do spelling, work in partners, use their best social skills, engage in debate. There are so many things that students have to do all day. Some of them they'll be really good at doing, and some of them will be a little bit tricky for individual students. So, kids are responsible for doing a lot of hard jobs at school. And what makes this whole thing even harder is that a lot of teachers focus pretty narrowly on a few excessively normative school skills. And so, if we were going to put all of those different things to know, understand, and do in a big list, and then choose which ones we think are most important, um, those are probably the ones that our lessons are going to tend to focus on a whole lot. And so, if you're a student who happens to be amazing at problem solving or design, but your teacher doesn't prioritize those in lesson planning and tend to focus on them, you might spend your days feeling really quite frustrated. Conversely, if you're one of those students who happens to be really good at some of these excessively normative skills, like being a great reader, being really physically coordinated, and having great handwriting, you may spend your day skipping successfully from lesson to lesson to lesson, thinking that you are the smartest kid in the class. We run into trouble when we're not really specific about what our learning objectives are because we fail to notice that we're hovering around the same small number of excessively normative learning objectives in every single lesson. And we put students with skills and abilities that are just outside those norms at a major disadvantage. This is a form of ableism in education. Now, you may be thinking that these 4 or 5 excessively normative school skills are the most important school skills and that we should spend all day, every day, working on these specific skills in every single lesson. I want to challenge your thinking around that. Let's think about what the future might hold. So, the one thing that we know about the future is that at the rapid pace of proliferation of technology, that our world will probably look completely different even in just the next 5 years. We also know that we'll be presented with a lot of challenges that are something that they actually call in the Army. They have this great word called VUCA, VUCA. So we know that the world in the future, the problems will be volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. There'll be novel challenges that we need to use the widest possible range of skills to address. And so while traditionally and historically school has focused on these excessively normative skills, we have every reason to believe that problem solving and design, public speaking, even story making, drawing, some of these um, less um, typical school skills will be extremely important to solve these novel and unexpected problems in the future. A great resource when you're thinking about the diversity of coulds in your teaching is the Ontario curriculum. So when I say could, I'm talking about things to know, things to understand, and be able to do. It talks about a huge range of different things to know, understand, and do in writing, far beyond simple handwriting or spelling. And so, if we underline some of the key phrases in here, we can see that the expectations for students in your classroom are really broad and diverse. We're looking for learners who know how to clarify thinking and sort ideas, express thoughts and feelings clearly. Um, People that are disciplined thinkers that can follow an idea through to its end. Sure, people that can use language conventions and write clearly, correctly, and precisely, but also produce writing that is interesting and original and that demonstrates capacity for independent critical thought. So, when was the last time you saw a lesson that had anything to do with writing that was getting at some of these deeper and more diverse learning objectives? It's all there for you in the curriculum. You just need to dig a little bit deeper and look for some of the more nuanced learning objectives. The same is true for the reading curriculum. There are all kinds of interesting nuances. And so, knowing that we need to know exactly what learning objectives are and be really clear with our students about what the learning objectives are, we can plan to always post those learning objectives on the board or somewhere clearly visible before we begin a lesson. This means that you should always have thought carefully about these and place them in your lesson plan. The whole idea is that you're going to use these intended learning objectives to really structure what the lesson involves, because you're going to directly and explicitly teach your students how to do these specific new either skills, or you're going to teach them some new knowledge, and then you're going to directly assess whether you were successful. So, for example, if these are your learning objectives, that you want students to focus on a 2-second recall for the 2 times table and to find 10 examples of multiples of 2, you'll create a great, creative, interesting lesson for them to work on this, directly teach it, and explicitly assess it. Here's another example of some learning objectives. Let's say we're teaching a lesson about writing and we're focusing specifically on quotation marks. These are pretty straightforward, but it's excellent for students to know exactly what they're going to be responsible for. It allows them to self-regulate their learning towards these really specific and tangible goals. We can also create learning objectives that dig a little more deeply into some of the more nuanced pieces of the curriculum. So it would be fun for me as a learner to be in a classroom where the learning objectives were to form and explain an original opinion or to express a feeling clearly. Here's one more example. This might be in a science class where we want to be extremely crystal clear with students about exactly what we want them to be able to do I'm going to teach you something today. And at the end of it, I want you to be able to make a 5-step written plan for the structure you're going to make in science. I also want you to understand these 6 specific new science terms. This is just good teaching, being extremely clear about your learning objectives, making sure you don't have way too many of them, and making sure that they're actually achievable for your students. Let's think about what can happen if you're not specific enough with your learning objectives. You may want students to write a little reflective piece about a field trip you took. And so you set them to work after a few brief instructions, and off they go. Some of them will be taking some time to draw a picture. Some of them may be zipping way ahead, producing volumes of writing. Some of them will be using conventional spelling, while others will be making spelling mistakes. And here you are walking around the room, the person who's responsible for giving feedback and eventually assessing this work. How will you know if any of them have achieved the goals that you set out, if the goals are so very imprecise? How will they know that they've achieved the goals that you set out if you haven't told them clearly what they are? It's very hard to feel a sense of accomplishment and engagement in a task if you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing, but you're pretty darn sure the person next to you is a better speller than you and can write a little bit faster than you. On the other hand, that person who's feeling so badly may be the most talented, critical, and creative writer in the room. So, this is the first big idea if you want to be an equitable and enabling teacher, that you need to think carefully and do a great job with your learning objectives. Good learning objectives are things that you can actually teach well in the time that you have. They should be simple enough for students to fully understand, remember, and strive for. They should be crystal clear and specific so students know exactly how to succeed. And they should be a range of knowing things, understanding things, and doing things. They should also be items you can actually assess in the time that you have available, like, do they actually know the math facts that you wanted them to practice and learn? Do they actually understand the concepts and ideas? And can they actually do the skills that you've tried to teach them? Your learning objectives should be varied, and they should truly represent the diversity in the curriculum and also in your learners. When you start writing down your learning objectives, you may notice that actually what you were really thinking about in all of your lessons, you're kind of circling around some pretty excessively normative skills, like reading skills, writing skills, or social skills in every lesson. Instead, we really want to dig out a much more diverse and broadly engaging range of learning objectives. Okay, now that you know exactly what you're trying to teach, let's think about how to actually do differentiation. Well, really, we're going to focus today on planning ahead for differentiation, but I want to signal to you 2 other ways that differentiation can happen. First of all, you can differentiate in an ad hoc way, sort of um, responsively as you go along through your lesson. It may be that you haven't planned much differentiation at all, but you notice that your students are exploring different methods and naturally adapting and accommodating what you've presented to better suit what they're capable of and what their abilities are. So, the advice here is just to always keep your eyes open, to be really sensitive and adaptive and responsive and flexible and super open minded and also trusting and furthermore curious and willing to differentiate right there in the moment. And so, this sounds a little bit like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. No, I don't mind that you're doing that. That looks like it's really, really helping you. Keep going. What a great little strategy you're using, or what a great little accommodation you've figured out. Or You can say to a student, hey, this doesn't seem to be working for you. What if you tried it in a different way? Do you have any ideas for how you'd like to try it? Or what if you went to the back of the room? Or what if you found a quiet place? Or what if you took a partner? This is the sort of in process approach to differentiation. Then, of course, you can do some collaborative differentiation. And I'm really biased towards this one. I think this one is really, really super feasible and really productive. You can ask your students directly what adjustments they think they might want and need. You can do this after you teach your lesson. You can say, you know exactly what the learning objectives are. So, what might be challenging for all of us in this, and what kinds of strategies, changes, what kinds of accommodations might we want to use to be more successful? And then you can write up a big list all together as a big group. Finally, you can plan your lessons with some ideas for differentiation in mind. And a lot of teachers do this. This is the path of differentiation where you begin your lesson with 2 to 5 different groups planned. So you've figured out slight adjustments to what the students are going to do, what types of materials they're going to use, and what kind of outputs they're going to produce. And you're all ready to assign different small groups. This is going to sound like I've put 3 groups on the board, or I've put out 3 trays of activities, or there are 3 baggies full of instructions. Check your activity card to see what you have to do. Maybe red group should start at my desk. So in this way, you can kind of rotate around and support those groups, focusing on maybe the group that you think will need your support the most. So let's talk about how to actually plan ahead for a differentiated lesson. I'm going to refer a lot to the model that was established by Carol Ann Tomlinson. I have a lot of respect for this model. It's really stood the test of time. So, the first thing Tomlinson would say is that we need to know a lot about our students. We need to know who they are as people, what interests them. We need to know their level of readiness. And by this, she means all the things that we can learn about them from reading their IEP, doing some pre assessment, understanding where their abilities and disabilities lie, and also understanding their learning profile. And by this, she means their learning preferences, the ways that they may prefer to tackle a task, things that have worked for them in the recent past, approaches that students may prefer. Then, of course, we need to be crystal clear about exactly what students need to know, understand, and do. Based on that, we can differentiate these 3 things. We can differentiate the content, so we can potentially offer them a different level of reading material. We could offer them recorded material or give them highlighted text. We can differentiate the processes they'll use, so we can give them different types of questions for different groups. We can encourage them to work in groups, work as individuals, or allow them to work in pairs. Or we could allow them to, instead of writing an assignment, let's say, we could allow them to dictate it. And so here we think of all of the assistive technology that we know so much about now. And then we can also differentiate the type of product that we're having them output. So maybe one group is going to work on a poster, another group's going to produce an essay, another group's really jazzed about public speaking and they're going to work on a speech. Or in a very sort of typical and old-fashioned assessment or product approach, where we're just giving them a test, and sure, this still happens all the time, we can give students a choice of different questions on the test that may appeal to them in different ways. Okay, so we're going to try to plan ahead to have some differentiated groups for our lesson. We're starting off with a really good understanding of exactly what our students need to know, understand, and do. And the next place we're going to stop is our class profile to think about, in light of what I'm going to ask them to know, understand, or do, what might be hard for them about it? What background, previous knowledge might they have about it? how might they be specially able or unable to do what I'm asking them to do? This is where a really nicely designed class profile can really come in handy. So look at this class profile made by a student from last year. She's got these tags embedded into her class profile that are searchable. And so if she wants to search up, for example, students who tend to work really well in pairs or who have said they like pairs before, she can just click on this and it searches up everybody that enjoys working in pairs. In any respect, whatever type of class profile you've made, hopefully you've made something that is going to be a really useful tool for your lesson planning. You may also have created some kind of a little activity or activity sheet where you're asking students, you're actively chasing some more data about how they like to learn, what feels good in the classroom. There are all kinds of cool ways to do this. So, to differentiate your lesson planning, basically, yep, you start with the curriculum, you think about what exactly students need to do. Then you keep in mind their interests, their readiness, and their learning profile, and you start to put together some groups. So, you can see that this teacher has put together 4 different groups. She may have put instructions for these groups in a tray, in a baggie, in a bin, at a table with a sign. There may be instructions on the board. And she's probably, or he or they, are going to have a very good idea of which of these groups will need their support right away. And so maybe this group, that is the only group with very different content, is going to need help right away to access content that may be stored in a digital file or that is accessed using some kind of assistive tech. And so that's how you organize that a little bit. Let me show you a worked example of exactly what this can look like. So here we are doing our lesson planning. We start with the curriculum. Let's imagine a grade 3 social studies lesson. We've gone through and figured out some really specific learning objectives based on some interesting aspects of the curriculum. The students need to know 4 facts about what life was like between a certain time period for a certain group of people. Then they need to be able to explain 2 ways that the residential school system changed life in these specific communities. So they know exactly what they need to do, right down to the quantity of examples and the quantity of facts. This makes it so easy for them to self-regulate. Then we look to the class profile, we think about everything we know, and we start building groups. For my first group, I might ask them to simply read from a text, work on a worksheet, and then I'm going to allow them to present what they came up with. So I'm going to ask this group to stand up in front of the class at the end and give a short oral presentation about these 2 learning objectives. Let's see how this group differs. So the next group is allowed to have a different product. So for this group, they're reading, they're using the same content, they're reading the text, they're using the worksheet, but this is a group that had an amazing time in another subject earlier in the week doing a rap, and they were desperate to do more rapping and to express more of their learning in this way. So I'm going to make some space for these students to make rap their finished product. Now let's go back and notice exactly how these 2 groups are different. For these 2 groups, the process is going to be different. So once again, they're reading the text, pages 2 through 7, but this group really doesn't like worksheets. They really like the freedom and the autonomy of making their own notes. So I'm going to allow them to do that. It's a bit more open-ended. I may ask them to make 6 or 7 point form notes, and then this group is going to be asked to make a presentation as well. The last group is going to differ in terms of content, differ in terms of process, and have the same product as the last group. So this group may need to work from an audio text. Now, if I have some really great assistive text set up in my classroom, this may be as simple as handing them a reader pen or having them scan the text onto an iPad and have the iPad read it out loud. This group wants to use a worksheet, so that's amazing. That's a nice uh, method. That's a nice process for them to take in the information, do the learning. But they are also really excited about doing a rap, so I'm going to let them do a rap. So you can see I haven't actually done anything all that amazing in my planning. This is not rocket science. It just takes a bit of extra forethought to think about small ways that I can tweak and adjust my lesson. Not so hard to do. I do want to take a moment right now to think about all of these considerations, to think about what it means to allow students to do work that appeals to their interests or that appeals to their learning preferences or that is suitable for their level of readiness or ability. So let's start with interest. Why should we differentiate the content, process, or product of a lesson by interest? Well, research tells us that things that we're interested in really recruit our attentional systems and encourage our persistence in the face of challenge. This can make learning a lot more culturally relevant, which is very enabling. And so, allowing students to focus on topics that they know a lot about, that may relate to their family of origin, their history, that may remind them of their elders or their culture. It also helps students to deepen and expand their interests. So, identifying that one of your students is really interested in, let's say, animals, and then giving them a chance to expand their expertise allows them to develop a little bit more of an identity. And it's really, really protective in adolescence and socially helpful to have a few things that you're good at and that you know a lot about. Um, we know that we can do this differentiation in a few ways. We can very simply just use familiar images, apps, illustrations in some of the materials that we use in terms of the content. In terms of the process, we can really vary the way we teach. If you have students who are interested in stories, music, or art, animals. These are all ways to grab attention and engagement by leveraging interests. It's also important to share some of your own interests and to model being an interested person. That's very, very supportive of students' ability to tap into their interests. You can let them apply certain skills in relevant areas of their interest. And so you're going to ask them to do a book report, but you may ask them exactly who would you like to do this book report on. And of course, you can let them create products that relate to their interests. And so, for example, our course, we do that. You're allowed to create a product. Let's say you're a camp counselor in the summer. It's okay by us if the product you create is a slideshow to train some of the junior counselors at your camp. In the same way, you can do this for students. If they're really interested in social media, let's say, you could let them produce a product that is some kind of a social media posting. When we're differentiating by interest, there are a few things to be cautious of and avoid. We want to really avoid assuming that students' interests are static. There's nothing worse than being pigeonholed. We want to avoid believing that we need to develop interest based lessons all of the time. You definitely don't. This is not a birthday party. Sometimes you can broaden their interests and introduce them to new things. And you don't need to provide entertainment that has nothing to do with the goods. So, if you can't connect the learning objectives to their interests, don't force it. Your job is to teach children all of the knowledge, the understanding, and the skills that they need. That is the most equitable thing that you can do. Give them a very powerful education. Okay, let's think about learning profile or learning preferences. So, these are the kinds of strategies that students tend to prefer, the ways they might approach the work. The first and most important thing to know about this is that every single one of us will have certain strategies and approaches that just feel great for us, and that is based on a whole bunch of different factors relating to our ability, disability, our previous life experiences, all of the way that our sensory processing systems work, every little thing that makes us unique as an organism on this earth. And so your sense that certain strategies work really well. You may have a sense that putting headphones on, listening to calming music, turning the lights down low, and having a snack while you work, that might work really, really well inside your mind and body. And it's very hard to break out of this very empathetic and generous bias that we have that tells us, oh, I really want that for all of my students. I want them to feel that comfort and ease. You have to remain open to the idea that for some of your students, that might feel really isolating, or they might feel really controlled if they were asked to do that. And so you have to really force yourself to believe that each and every student in your classroom is set up to need and want and thrive while using slightly different types of approaches, and that they really will have unique and different preferences. And you will always, no matter how hard it is to believe, there are students out there that work really well with loud music in their headphones. And it's not all of them, but it sure doesn't hurt to let them try. Um, and this applies for a whole range of little processes and approaches and preferences that might seem like a stretch to you. I would recommend that you really don't let yourself shut those down right away. Instead, just run it like an experiment. Let students see, does this work for me? And the proof will be in the pudding. If they don't get their work done, that gives you a chance to say, hey, I don't think that worked for you. Let's consider something different next time. As you're thinking about the different types of learning preferences, you may want to consider this range of continuums that describe a lot of different factors that may be impacted by culture in learning. And so just cast your eyes down this list. You might want to experiment with putting your own preference somewhere on this continuum. And it would be very interesting to share this continuum with your students in some form or another and see how many of them actually differ from you. Another nice way to start chipping away at what might be a very friendly and generous but unhelpful bias towards your students, and in thinking that they might enjoy what you enjoy. You want to be careful, of course, not to get trapped in a certain stereotype of what kinds of approaches work for different people, and get locked into that one preference that worked for them on that one day. So those are some things to think about there. Okay, let's talk about something that Tomlinson refers to as readiness, but that kind of veers into ability as well. So, the first thing to think about is that Tomlinson talks about readiness as a student's level of enthusiasm for engaging in learning. So, think about a group of 4 students in your classroom who are fascinated by a certain topic, let's say anteaters. And so they've been scouring the library for books, and they're reading books at a pretty high level, and they're really, really excited about anteaters. There's one person in that group who actually isn't able to read the books, but knows a lot about anteaters, has seen an anteater on vacation, is totally excited to be involved in this learning. That's a high level of readiness. And you can make groups of students that are sorted by readiness. But the other facet to this is ability. And so we definitely can do a little bit of differentiation with ability in mind. We can put the students who need to use audio recorded materials in the same group from time to time. Or we can allow students for whom a certain process is more comfortable to be in the same group from time to time. We have to be really careful when we're doing this, because students who have disability in certain areas might actually also have a high degree of readiness and a high degree of interest in doing a certain type of learning. Strong ability can coexist with a low degree of readiness as well. I want to say just a little bit more about differentiating by ability before we move along. So, historically, and actually probably currently, when most teachers think about differentiation, they're thinking about differentiating by ability. They're thinking about creating a high, middle, and low group where everyone in the room probably knows they're in the high group and everybody knows exactly who's in the low group. We don't want to do this on any kind of regular basis. It really amounts to streaming students, which we're trying to move away from. We don't want to create static streams where certain students feel like they're locked into a low ability group. It's really prioritizing and paying a lot of attention to deficit. And we want to avoid this. It creates barriers to achievement and opportunity. It creates a lot of stigma and discrimination amongst students, which can be pretty socially limiting. And it deprives students who may find themselves again and again in a low seeming group of high expectations that would be applied in a more heterogeneous grouping of students. When we're creating high, middle, and low ability groups, we're privileging excessively normative tasks and a culture that really construes any kind of difference from those norms as disability. Another thing to be cautious of is that some of the tests that are used to sort students into high, middle, low ability are not very fair for students who are minoritized, racialized, who are not wealthy, who are not exactly like the sample of students who were the sample used to norm the test in the first place. So we know that there is a lot of imprecision in the way students' ability level is determined. When we focus all the time on high, middle, low, we really fuel this diagnosis and disability obsessed assessment of students, where we're constantly looking to sort out the students who are not as good at certain skills, and leads to a phenomenon called disability spread, where we tend to see those students through a lens of deficit and, and hold low expectations for them, which is really not great for our relationship. It is something that is very noticeable to the children that you're working with. They will know if you are always putting them in a low ability group, and they will feel badly about it, and they will lose trust in your ability to see all of the things that make them special and able and powerful. So, you know a lot now about how to do this process of differentiated lesson planning. It's not so hard. Here's a few things to keep in mind overall. Challenge yourself to differentiate in a really dynamic and diverse and interesting and creative and imaginative way. Try really hard not to put the same kids in the same darn groups every darn time. Nobody likes that. Challenge yourself not to group kids according to ability or readiness every darn time. Nobody likes to feel like their level of ability is the most important thing about them. Again, avoid ability grouping every time. This is such an easy habit to fall into. Yes, sometimes we need to remediate key skills, and we will need to be putting those students into high, middle, and low reading remediation groups when we're offering our direct and explicit instruction. Um, but we do not need to put together every single lesson like this. We focus on reading remediation when it's time to do that. And during all of our other lessons, we can accommodate that with assistive tech if it is not one of our key learning objectives. Also, be aware that you shouldn't be using really similar coulds every time. We want to dig deeply into the curriculum and use a diverse range of learning objectives for our wonderfully diverse group of learning skills of students that have diverse skills and wisdom and background knowledge and interests. Um, Also be aware that you're not sort of implicitly creating one really fun activity and a whole bunch of activities that are just a little bit less fun and a little bit less exciting. We don't want to create groups that are, some of them are boring and some of them are awesome. The challenge is to make every single group's task really respectful and delightful. And don't lose sight of how important clear and specific learning objectives are as you explore differentiation. Yeah, it's great to think about all kinds of accommodations like wobbly stools or partners, headphones, all kinds of assistive tech, but none of that differentiation, none of those accommodations are worth anything if they're not helping your students to succeed at becoming more educated, more empowered, learning new skills, understanding new concepts, and building new knowledge. As a student, it can feel, when you have a DI mastermind for a teacher, it can feel a little bit like that differentiation is being done to you. This model of differentiation where we plan ahead can feel a little top down and teacher directed. Students can feel stuck in a certain interest group. They can get trapped in a teacher's first impression of their learning profile, or they can feel limited by a teacher's sense of their ability or readiness. I want you to know that good old Carol Ann Tomlinson foresaw all of this and addressed it in one of the very first iterations of her model, reminding us all to always present respectful tasks to each and every group of students, to ensure that all of the groups that we composed on a day-to-day, week-to-week, and month-to-month basis are flexible, and that students know that they can move in and out of groups all the time so no one feels stuck. She encouraged us to engage in ongoing assessment so that those class profiles and all of that information that we were building up about students didn't get stuck at what they are capable of in October or November, but that we continually update our understanding of what our students can do, and that we're constantly adjusting our groupings, um, uh, both ahead of time, week to week, day to day, but also minute to minute in the classroom, so that if a student is really drawn to a group in which they have not been placed, that they know that that is open and available to them as long as it will be appropriate. Finally, and I hope we're all thinking a lot about this when we engage in some practice of these skills, let's talk about how to make this feasible. Here are a few tips. Number one, start slowly. If differentiating means two groups for you when you first start out, that is so much better than one group. It's a great place to start. Number two, make sure your students are comfortable with the philosophy of differentiation and they understand what you're doing and they feel safe with your approach. I'm sure by now you're beginning to develop a good philosophy of equitable and enabling education. And this will be a conversation that you're looking forward to having with your students. Make sure you have some kind of an anchor activity that students can come back to during ragged time. This means if one or two groups might happen to finish early, you want to have one good anchor activity that they can go straight to, so you don't have a whole bunch of students standing up and running around in circles and needing your attention while you're maybe working with another group or otherwise occupied. Make sure you give your instructions carefully and with consideration. You don't want to call attention to groups who may be making use of assistive tech. You don't want to call attention to any kind of accommodation within the different groups. Remember how important it is for students to have privacy, a little bit of privacy, and how proud they are about what skills they are working on at the time. And so task cards can be really helpful. Rather than displaying the different activities up on the board, putting a task card in a bin or a baggie provides for a measure of privacy and discretion and really reduces the students' focus on who is exactly doing what. Most of the time, you won't be differentiating every single part of the task. So there will be enough in common that the students feel like they're part of one big team. You need to spend some time thinking about what this system is going to be. Are you a baggy person? Maybe you're going to get some little bins. Maybe you're going to go and get some boxes from the dollar store. Maybe there's something that's already being used in your classroom. But you really want to focus on creating that seamless environment where the students know what's coming. There's a good, predictable system, and it offers them some privacy and discretion. Again, make plans for what students should do when they need help on something. So maybe you want to think about doing what Stacy Falconer does. Maybe the students are going to have a little light on their desk that they turn on when they need help. Maybe they're going to put their name tag in a bin or a bucket or in a specific spot on the board. Maybe you're going to have them write their name on a list on the board. But it's a good idea to encourage them to ask a few friends and then maybe put their name in a list, in a bucket, wherever, and then carry on and continue doing what they can do. What you don't want is a lineup of students at your desk just waiting, waiting, and waiting. Another thing that will make this all much more feasible is if students know how the work period is going to be called to a stop. So you might have a routine where you ring a little bell when there is 1 minute left or 5 minutes left, or you dim the lights when there's only a few minutes left, so that students have a chance to ease gracefully towards the end of what they're trying to achieve. It just reduces a little bit of the chaos. You also want to make plans for how to minimize noise, extra movement, and off task behavior in the room. So, this might be just really making sure that everybody has every single thing they're going to need to accomplish their differentiated task. Putting scissors where scissors need to be, glue, markers, whatever it is they might need, and reminding them that if they're not sure where something is, to ask a friend or two before they come and interrupt you and whatever it is that you're doing. And in terms of minimizing off task behavior, all of this organization will go a really long way. But if you're still having a hard time, it's a really great idea to just stop the whole group and have a conversation and do some problem solving together about how to minimize chaos and keep everybody on track. And as long as you engage in a conversation like that with genuine curiosity and an open mind and a willingness to learn together, you can expect great results. Okay. Before we end this discussion, let's just clean up a few problems that may be rattling around in the back of your mind. Even if you're not having these problems, it will be very good to have some clarity on how to answer them for other people. Okay. So we are going to have coulds that sometimes don't include reading ability. And so sometimes our lessons are going to have completely accommodated reading skills. And so you may be asking, but wait a minute, what if they need intensive reading remediation? What if I feel like they should be working on reading all day, every day? The big idea here is that the fact that they have a disability in one area of the curriculum cannot take the place of every other opportunity that they ought to have to learn and feel engaged and feel creative and inspired. It can't take the place of their involvement in other learning. If we make lots of opportunities throughout the day when they can do things that they love and experience success and use some assistive technology to help them with their reading, those experiences of success will lead them towards more success, will build their sense of self-efficacy, their confidence. It will give them more energy. It will help their brain work better. All of those positive emotions will make their executive functions work better. They'll be able to pay attention better. Their working memory will work better. Um, so pay close attention to how much of their day is spent in remedial teaching, where they know they're receiving extra help for something that's not working for them, and how much of the day they're spending doing learning that feels empowering, that leverages all of their ability, their capacities, their interests, and their readiness. They should not be feeling as though their entire day is remediation. Sometimes people worry that we actually just can't take the reading and writing expectation out of everything. We have to remember the point of school isn't actually reading and writing, it's learning and thinking and expression. Reading and writing are means to those ends. We know that there are functional and successful people at all levels who can't read and write independently without assistive tech or accommodation. Some students in general just don't seem to keep up to their peers. This is something we hear when we're advocating for differentiation. You may have a student in your classroom who seems really down on their luck, who doesn't have any confidence, who's not really even willing to share with you things that they are interested in. This is really common. They may have had a really difficult year. The prior year, they may be having a really difficult time in the rest of their life. You know how it feels when things aren't going well. You feel like you're bumbling and confused and overwhelmed, and like nothing is going right. The best thing for those students is to know that their teacher believes in them and is going to continue holding them to high standards and giving them great opportunities. Students who are having a hard time don't need to be put into smaller and smaller and smaller boxes. So that concludes this lecture on differentiated lesson planning. I hope it gives you a new lens through which to examine all of the practices that you see in classrooms around you. I also hope it's given you some good practical guidance for how to create equitable and enabling lesson plans for your students.